Elm Tree had his field to himself. He stood alone in a wide and deep expanse of wind-swept grass, which once a year surged around him, filled with the rows of clover, the whiteness of daisies, and the gold of buttercups. The rest of the time, the field was green, lush grass, or maybe even the glittering of snow. But always there stood the tree, like a guardian, with his strong green branches filled with the splendor of leaves in the summer and the naked grace in the winter. In all of the mountains, there wasn't another tree which could compare to him. He was matchless. On one side of the field in which the tree stood, there was a small cabin with an old crumbling stone wall, almost as old as the tree. On the other side of the field, there stood a new, painted fence with a modern house, pretentious and ornate, with bracketed cornices, bay windows, a wraparound porch, and a cupola. The cupola especially disturbed the mind of the dweller in the old house. The name of this dweller was David Ransom. He was quite old and had a stiff leg, which necessitated a gait wherein the leg swung in a rigid half circle before it was brought to the accomplishment of a forward step. You see, David had been incapacitated from work for some years. All he had in this world was his run-down cabin and a patch of land in the rear, on which he raised vegetables and kept a few hens, which furnished his humble subsistence. But it hadn't always been this way. Once upon a time, he had owned the great field on which the mighty elm tree stood. As a boy, he had spent countless days climbing and playing in the tree. In a sense, they had grown old together. And moreover, David had even owned the new house beyond, although in a simpler form. He had built it with his own two hands. That's right, David had been a jack of all trades and able to turn his hand to almost any craft with skill. He had lived in the old cabin that had been in his family for 4 generations until he was almost an old man with his wife. And that's when David took his lifetime savings and built that new house. Oh, he loved it and handled tenderly every nail he had put in it. Every fragrant length of pine, he had built it with the utmost care that was in him. Then, just as it was finished, he lost it. The bank in which all his savings were stored had failed. And for David, there was nothing left to meet the payments, and he was forced to sell both the house and the field at a miserable sacrifice. To make matters worse, David's wife died shortly afterwards, and many said it was because of the disappointment that had been too much for her. All her life, she had planned and dreamed about the new house, which was to stand on that vacant lot. And after she died, David lived all alone, all wound up like a caterpillar in a cocoon of isolation. He seemed bitter to the core. The mere mention of banks sent him into a white heat of rage. Before long, strangers became the new owners of the house that he had poured his soul into building. One of his special bitternesses was the improvements which the new owner had made to his new house. That new owner's name was Thomas Savage, and when he set out about building a big bay window on the blank of the south wall, David fairly swelled with indignation and humiliation. And on the morning when the scaffolding for the new bay window was erected, David went across the street, swinging his lame leg around viciously to his old friend Abner Slocum's homestead. Now David and Abner, they had been friends since they were wet behind the ears. And now the old man sat on the porch and grinned as David approached. A few moments later, David settled himself laboriously on the porch step in front of Abner. Inside the cabin, the sound of a sewing machine could be heard, coming from Abner's daughter, Maria, who was busy making a new dress. David's lame leg was stretched out unbendingly as the mountaineer scowled Abner, I'm about tired of all these folks coming to East Tennessee by the scores every day and trying to change things to look just like the place they left. For the life of me, I can't just figure out why they didn't just stay where they were. Have you seen what they're doing to that house I built?" But old Abner pretended not to hear him. Oh, he knew how much that house meant to his old friend. Besides, Abner had been gazing forth at the glories of that spring morning, and he answered from the fullness of his thoughts. "Yep, I guess spring is almost over, sure enough," he said happily. But David, he sniffed with fury. "Spring!" he cried, and then he shouted, reaching out with a knotted hand, and pointed violently towards the house on which the workmen were hammering. "See what they're doing over there?" he demanded, biting off every word with a syllable short snarl. "Yep, I sure have," Abner answered cheerfully. "They making improvements, ain't they?" "Improvements? For what, though?" "Why, the way I built that house, it was fit for the president himself to live in." "Yep, that window sure is gonna look real pretty, though, ain't it?" inquired old Abner innocently. But Abner's answer only seemed to anger David, who glared at him, and without saying another word, he rose, dragging his lame leg after him. Then he was gone down the path with a stiff strut, while old Abner just chuckled. David didn't seem to appreciate the old friend's sense of humor today, and after he returned home, David couldn't stop watching those carpenters working across the field, and soon the new bay window and the porch was completed. So was their shiny new tin roof glittering in the sun. And as time passed, more shiny houses began to pop up across the field. Gone were many of the beautiful creeks and the animals who had drank from them. The only thing that remained was the beautiful Old Elm Tree. And David, well, he fell fairly ill. He neither ate nor slept. His eyes looked wild in their jungle of unkempt beard and long white hair. Everywhere he went, folks heard him talking out loud to himself while making furious gestures. Many of these new out-of-towners, their children would just stare at him, while others would run away when they saw him coming. And before long, these newcomers in the small community began to whisper that crazy old mountaineer, David Ransom, needed to be sent off to the county poorhouse, where he could be looked after and wouldn't be able to do harm to himself. And let's face it, his old house was an eyesore to all those out-of-towners. Come to think of it, there'd be no shortage of folks willing to tear that old thing down and build a shiny new house in its place. But David, no, he continued to fume with every improvement that was made to the new house that he had once built for his wife. But at last, the cupola was built and placed on the roof, and that was the final straw. That night, a strange thing happened. The new house, which had been built by David and purchased and improved by Thomas Savage, was burned to the ground. It started around midnight, and the sky was rosy for miles around, and the air was filled with church bells, summoning every man to quickly help put out the fire. But by dawn, there was only a bed of glowing coals and ashes. Now, although there wasn't any proof, everyone suspected David was responsible for the fire, and it was then decided that he was too dangerous of a character. Combined with his age and feebleness, it was time to put him away in a home where he could be taken care of. A few days later, a couple of officers from Johnson City set out on their way to David's, bound and determined to take him away. And as they passed Abner Slocum's cabin in a cloud of dust, they hollered out, "Howdy, Abner, sure is a hot day." But Abner waited until they had passed, and then he slowly shook his fist at them. By the next morning, folks far and wide knew that the officials were going to take that crazy old man, David Ransom, away from the land that he had called home ever since he was born. and Abner Slocum's daughter, Maria, peeped through the curtains of her sewing room.
Poor man. I don't see why they can't just leave him alone. He never set that fire, any more than I did. Oh, he wouldn't even hurt a baby kitten.
And just then, there was the sounds of wheels outside.
I guess they'd come for him now.
The woman peeped out around the curtain, and the men, they were going through David's front gate and knocking at his door. But there was no answer, and after several minutes, the officer slowly opened the front door to David's cabin.
David Ransom, are you in here? We're from the county office to talk to you.
But there wasn't a single peep in response. David was nowhere to be found. So the officers turned their wagons towards Abner and Marie Slocum's place.
Oh no, they're coming over here.
Marie exclaimed. Old Abner, he was sitting on the front porch with his handkerchief over his eyes. He hadn't even stirred. Marie shook him violently by the shoulder.
Paul, wake up. The law is here.
But Abner didn't budge. The officers began questioning the old man and his daughter as to if they had seen David Ransom that day. But old Abner, he didn't hear a word of it. Instead, he gave an old sleepy grunt like a disturbed animal as he shrugged his shoulder loose from his daughter's grasp. He fiddled with a handkerchief placed over his face, settled his head back, and gave vent to an ostentatious snore. The lawman, who was a thin-nosed and exceedingly tall man, shook his head and then turned towards his wagon, presumably to search for David Ransom. Marie looked over hard at her father, who was sitting quite still, making a loud, purring sound. And finally, she went into the house. Yet, the minute she was gone, old Abner slipped the handkerchief from his face and stared with a wonderful keenness from his bright old eyes across the road at that beautiful old elm tree in the midst of the field, in a rosy and green foam of grass and clover. He waved his handkerchief, which he had taken from his face, and in the distance there was a tiny answering gleam of white waving from the massed canopy of the elm. Old Abner chuckled softly and thought to himself, look at that tree over there. Ain't it beautiful? It's the most handsomest tree in these mountains, and it's all David's. Nobody else has the right to set foot in it. Can't nobody find any fault with that tree, and nobody's gonna build no bay windows or shiny roofs on it either. Inside the canopy rested David Ransom. His face was inexpressibly changed. All the bitterness and rancor were gone. It was the face of a man in shelter from the woes and stress of life. He looked forth from the beautiful arms of the great tree as a child from the arms of its mother. He had fled for shelter to the heart of nature, and it had not failed him. He was comfortably astride in a large burrow with another below it, affording him a rest to his feet. His back and head were against the trunk of the tree as he rested as comfortably as if it was a custom-made recliner midway up the tree, wrapped in the safety of an old friend. Ah, the old elm tree.